A few weeks ago, I hosted a live stream where I designed a group of sapient aliens that evolved on a gas giant. In the end, we wound up with the Eyes, a group of floating squid monsters with transparent skin and the ability to shoot lightning bolts from their fingertips. So let's talk about that. Our story begins on the lowly planet of Chus, a large gas planet a bit bigger than Jupiter that orbits a red hypergiant star in the outskirts of the Milky Way galaxy. You can think of this planet's atmosphere as being made up of a number of different regions. The outermost region had a thin atmosphere, similar to what you may find here on Earth, while the next section down was much denser, allowing for certain creatures to more easily float, or even swim, through the air, despite the fact that the terrain was still entirely gaseous. That was in contrast to the next deepest region, however, which slowly became more and more liquid-like thanks to the mounting gravitational pressure of the planet's mass. From here, the deeper you went, the darker and denser your surroundings became, until you eventually reached the core. Unlike Earth, whose life is nearly exclusive to its thin layer of outer crust, Chus's atmosphere was teeming with life all the way through, from strange bird-like creatures weaving between the highest clouds to astronomical leviathans hardy enough to walk across the planet's core. This absurdly high degree of biomass and the density of the surrounding atmosphere allowed for some of the largest creatures in the known universe, such as the Oddning Evil, a colossal ambush predator that filled a similar niche as Earth sharks. But unlike a shark, from snout to tail they measured an average of 2 kilometers. While not the largest, the Oddning Evil was certainly larger than most other lifeforms on the planet. But even an average-sized creature on Chus was considered to be absolutely massive when compared to most other worlds, such as the aforementioned Eyes, a creature that, in its home environment, was entirely unnoteworthy for its size, despite the fact that it was nearly twice as long as a blue whale. Like many other Chusian creatures, the Eyes had a transparent body that allowed for a clear view of its internal organs, including its singular eye, which took the form of a cylindrical tube that wrapped around the brain and allowed for 360-degree vision in all directions. They also had a set of retractable exterior jaws adapted to crush the shells of their natural prey. These jaws were accompanied by dexterous tentacles that could sort through the resulting carnage and return anything that was soft enough to digest into their open stomach. But while their anatomy was fairly typical for their planet, their intellect was anything but. From very early on in their history, the Ages were able to craft sophisticated tools and even formed a number of distinct cultures. The most successful of these cultures, at least at first, were the Pastoralists. They lived in the uppermost region of Chus's liquid atmosphere. This was home to the floating rainforest that punctuated much of the planet's terrain. These quote-unquote rainforests were essentially voids of floating plant matter that clumped together into interconnected groves, many of which were continental in size. From there, countless creatures slowly adapted for life in their canopies, such as the Pastoralists, who went further than most other animals in strategically allowing the algae and other plant life to grow across their entire body, resulting in a sort of pelt of protective fur. As they grew more skilled in their abilities, these pelts became the home of a mini biosphere, perfectly engineered with the Aja's best interest in mind. From a gallery of barnacle-like creatures that were grown as a sort of plated armor to a species of eusocial bug that was allowed to build hives on their skin so long as they looked after the algae beds and kept them from growing unwieldy. Another common creature in these biospheres was the Nunan, a slug-like lifeform that fed off the countless parasites trying to subsist off the Aja's blood. But among these more bizarre examples of livestock in pastoralist society, there were others that were more recognizable to us on Earth. Such as the Glarba, a creature that currently fills a similar role as Earth cows, but started off as the shell prey items that the Ajas originally evolved to hunt. Over time, the pastoralists began to herd and breed them, making their shells thinner and easier to crack, until they eventually faded away into nothing at all. In all, thanks to the excess of resources allowed by their plentiful environment and their early foray into agriculture, the pastoralists were able to multiply faster than any other race of Aja on the planet. But the discovery that truly gave them a lead over the other groups was their revelation of germ theory. For nearly all of their history, the pastoralists, and indeed all Ajas, were extremely proficient in surgery, thanks to their transparent skin, which gave them a clear, unimpeded view of every organ. However, the pastoralists were the first to discover pathogens and viruses, and by extension, the first to develop cures and vaccines against them. These inventions resulted in greater life expectancies and stronger communities amongst the pastoralists, to the point that even their plentiful homeland grew overpopulated, and so they searched for a new environment in which to colonize. While it may seem that the obvious solution was to climb higher into the atmosphere, after all, the floating rainforest stretched clear into the planet's greatest elevations, they were already pushing the limits of their highest habitable range. Any further and their bodies would begin to decompress from the relative lack of pressure. And so they turned their attention downward to the stormy depths of the lower ocean, a vast expanse so deep that the only visible light was bioluminescent life and the near constant lightning storms that raged on, thanks to the friction of its dense atmosphere. This land, known as the Lesser Maelstrom, has long been populated by an indigenous group known as the Storm Mages, a group that earned their name thanks to the martial art they've been forced to master in this harsh environment. You see, with how common lightning in this region really was, it's almost inevitable that you will eventually be struck. So the vast majority of life endemic to this area have developed a natural defense, including the Ige, who originally evolved here and as such are born with the ability to reflect lightning strikes with relatively little injury. That being said, it's still incredibly painful and can, on rare occasions, be outright fatal to be struck by lightning, which inspired the Storm Mages to develop the martial art that would quickly become their namesake. A martial art that allows them to safely redirect the flow of electricity through and out of their body. While this was a necessary skill for day-to-day survival in this part of the world, it could also be used as a weapon, with a few masters of the art using it to fling bolts of lightning at one another with the intent of death and serious injury. Many have even taken to using antler-shaped lightning rods to actively attract the surrounding electricity, allowing for more devastating attacks. You can assess the skill of a given mage based on the size of their ornamental antlers. After all, the larger the set, the more electricity it'll attract, at the cost of making it more cumbersome to move and fight with. As for the origins of these antlers, they come from the crests of Jarled stars, massive creatures that absorb and utilize the static electricity of their surroundings for the purposes of filter feeding. This process produces a ton of light, and in fact, they are the brightest thing in the mage's environment. Add to this the fact that their migrations occur on a set schedule, the mages have learned to use their movements as a method of telling time. They have since become a highly respected animal in Storm Mage society. So respected, in fact, they have greatly affected the mage's religion. Like most Iges, the Storm Mages believed their planet was the womb of a fertility goddess named Ilvi. But unlike the Pastoralists, who view their deity as a kind and nurturing caretaker, the Mages see her more as a dangerous warrior, thanks to the ferocity in which Mother Jarled stars defended their young. When the Pastoralists invaded the Lesser Maelstrom, they were met with great antagonism from the native residents. Not only that, but the land itself seemed to fight against them, with devastating lightning storms ravaging the Pastoralist troops even before they had a chance to engage with the Storm Mage strongholds. The war for the Maelstrom was long and brooding, with the Pastoralists fighting tooth and nail for every inch of territory they secured. But the biggest roadblock they faced was soldier morale. As previously stated, the Pastoralists were raised in a beautiful landscape of sunshine, clear skies, and towering rainforests, while the Lesser Maelstrom was a deadly land of permanent storms and perpetual darkness, so deep in the atmosphere that it harbored no plant life. And yet, the Pastoralist youth were expected to lay their life on the line in order to steal this hellscape from its native inhabitants. Needless to say, the propaganda regimes of the upper atmospheric ocean had their work cut out for them when it came to selling the public on the necessity of this war. But work they did, and eventually the powers of the upper ocean had amassed enough resources to conquer the Lesser Maelstrom in its entirety. The final nail in the Storm Mage's coffin was the advent of biological warfare. Endemic to the floating rainforests of the upper atmosphere was a small-bodied parasite known as the Catan. These creatures were adapted for a life cycle in which they would inject their eggs into the stomach of an Ige, allowing their child to feed on the half-digested meals that their host had swallowed. When the Pastoralists began breeding and utilizing the Nanan, these Catan became a non-issue, but the Storm Mages had no such defenses, and so the Pastoralist military created blimp-like structures that could airdrop millions of fertile Catan, swarming the Lesser Maelstrom with a parasitic blight that they had no defenses against. The mages were wiped out in a matter of months, and those who managed to survive were forced to retreat even deeper into the atmosphere, into a section of the planet just beyond its core known as the True Maelstrom. The Pastoralists didn't bother to follow them, because it was a well-known fact that the True Maelstrom was inhospitable, to the extent that it was literally called the Land of the Dead. In fact, for most of their history, the Storm Mages had banished criminals into the deepest depths as a slightly more honorable alternative to the death sentence. But little did they know, some of these banished men had survived, and over the centuries had cultivated a civilization of their own. They called themselves the Walking Spirits, since they too viewed the True Maelstrom as a sort of afterlife, despite the fact that they lived there. Much of their culture was heavily bound up in death symbology, and they were one of the only civilizations on the planet that didn't primarily worship some sort of fertility goddess. Instead, they worshipped Tigroth, the embodiment of death and time. But there was good reason to assume the Land of the Dead was inhospitable. The atmosphere was so dense and the eternal winds so fast that the electric storms were unmatched by anything the Lesser Maelstrom had ever experienced. Lightning bolts hundreds of feet wide were a common occurrence, so common that the spirits didn't even bother with storm magic, opting to simply avoid the strikes whenever possible. One way they did this was by domesticating and then living aside some of the truly gargantuan creatures endemic to this region, such as the Odninganesk, a serpentine creature that used the sail-like structures along its back to sail just above the surface of the core at otherwise impossible speeds. It was by far the largest creature on the planet, measuring at a remarkable 4.5 kilometers from beak to tail. Thanks to this unbelievable size, it was able to absorb and reflect most of the stray lightning that would otherwise prove an issue to the spirit-walking handlers that accompanied it. But the Odding-a-Nesk was not the only creature they had in their arsenal. Another was the Yelai Star, a highly derived creature that used a similar lightning rod method as the Jarl stars, but to a very different effect. Instead of creating an ambient field of static electricity in order to attract floating debris, the Yelai Star collected energy from its surroundings in order to power and subsequently produce a devastating laser beam from the front of its face. This laser could burn through practically anything, but since the Yelai Star was a herbivore, fulfilling a similar niche as Earth's wildebeests, it was mostly used against megapredators and similar threats, which meant the small-bodied IJs were able to approach, domesticate, and ultimately harness the terrible power of the Yelai Star, with those who controlled them, known as the Mahouts, becoming some of the most powerful people in the Land of the Dead. Decades later, when Storm Mage refugees descended into the true Maelstrom, they warned the Spirit Walkers of the imminent threat of the Pastoralists, telling them of the long territorial battle they defended themselves against over the past several years, telling them of the Pastoralist soldiers whose populations were so massive that it didn't matter how many you killed, there would always be more, and finally telling them of the horrible blight these soldiers had inflicted on the Storm Mage people. Now, the Pastoralists had no interest in invading the true Maelstrom, not now nor anytime soon. But the Storm Mages didn't know that, and least of all, the Spirit Walkers didn't know that. For all they knew, it was only a matter of time before this unkillable army descended into the Land of the Dead and slaughtered everybody down there. So the Spirit Walkers decided to make the first move. Invading the Lesser Maelstrom with a fleet of 1,000 Yelai Star, they burnt the mid-construction colonies down to a crisp. They killed every Pastoralist soldier they found and took to beating the surviving troops with the bones of their surviving comrades. But they didn't stop at the Lesser Maelstrom. They ventured further into the heavens, torching the floating rainforests and pillaging the scenic farmlands that the Pastoralists called home. They sacked their capital city and freed their slaves. They killed with no remorse and redeemed 1,000 years trapped in the deepest depths until there wasn't a single Pastoralist civilian left to defend themselves. Now, you may be asking yourself, wasn't it the Storm Mages that banished the Spirit Walkers, not the Pastoralists? And if so, then you're absolutely right. But after so many years in isolation, the Spirit Walkers had forgotten a part of their history. They don't remember exactly who had cast them into the Land of the Dead, just that it was someone from the higher atmosphere. So, when an antagonistic group from the highest habitable region of the atmosphere presented themselves as a villain, they weren't inclined to ask, but is this the right bad guy? All they did was kill him. But regardless of the specifics, the Spirit Walkers were now the de facto rulers of Chus, with the Storm Mages as a far from equal but still respected secondary class. Over time, they rebuilt and cultivated the remaining farmland and floating rainforest that had survived the war unharmed, thereby kicking off a secondary agricultural revolution. From there, their society began to make countless discoveries, from metalworking to industrialism, though they wouldn't rediscover germ theory until much later in their history. The last advent of technological prowess that I'll leave you with today will be their foray into space exploration. Over time, many IJs wanted to explore the uppermost levels of their atmosphere and developed a cutting-edge spacesuit in order to pursue that dream. It was essentially an autoclave that produced an immense amount of pressure on the person inside, just as they were used to in their home environment. Using these autoclaves, they began to explore further and further until their planet's gravity became so weak that they needed to make flying machines to explore any further. This eventually led to the first out-of-orbit mission in IJ history, but at the time they didn't view it that way. Due to living on a gas giant, their species had never seen a clear view of the sky, and as such had no concept of space. So as far as the cosmonauts on board of that ship were concerned, they were simply exploring yet another part of their planet's atmosphere. A part of the atmosphere that just so happened to be even thinner than any other section. But once they saw the stars, for the very first time in IJ history, they knew they had stumbled on something else entirely. Part 2 of this video is still in production. Usually, with videos like this, I develop the entire species history at once and release the two parts side by side. But this time I decided to make them both separately. That way I can not only develop their worlds more thoroughly, but also so you guys can have a better idea as to what is and isn't canon when we start working on the space age. Because yeah, these videos are developed in tandem with the people on my channel and on my Discord server. I got a lot of ideas in this video from you guys over there. From the Odding Evil to the Pastoralist algae coats to the Maelstrom and the Land of the Dead. This video wouldn't be anything at all like it is without the help from all of you. And if you'd like to join me as we discuss the far future of the species, then you can join my server now at the link in the description. Nothing is set in stone as of yet, but I'm pretty sure there's going to be a zombie apocalypse at one point or another, so that should be interesting. I'd also like to thank my beautiful patrons for their continued support, including Lord Frostrake and the Deranged, Sridhar Shangalpet, MTL, Toothy Jones, Edgy Electrokinetic, and JJ Walker 05. You guys are what makes this all possible. But until next time, don't die. See you guys later.
There is power in a factory, there is power in the land, there is power in the hand of the worker. But it all amounts to nothing if together we don't stand. Oh, there is power in a union.